Okay. So yes, this webinar is being recorded and it'll eventually be posted on the ICC website and on YouTube with captions. So you can come back to it or share it with a colleague or with anyone who might find it useful. Okay, that is everything that I had. John, you can go ahead and take it away.
Hey, awesome. Find where my windows are. Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Natalia, for that wonderful introduction. I'm really excited to be here. This is kind of a culmination of a good chunk of work that I've been working on for the past couple of years. So I'm kind of excited to share some of the stuff I found, some of the ideas that I have, and I look forward to also getting a little bit of feedback. So diving more into the crayfish stuff. Today, I really hope to be able to describe some of the ways that agencies are able to assess new species of concern, tools they've used in the past, but also ones they might be considering for in the future, and also be able to describe some of the methods that they use to identify species that are invasive and also ones that are not. I hope to be able to provide a little bit more insight into those tools for you and also to be able to use them quickly in decision-making processes and how they can be used be used in the future to consider invasions both in the US, but as we all know, more realistically, invasions abroad as well. So just this. So before I dive into that, I just want to describe who I am a little bit more specifically. Natalia went over basically everything. First and foremost, you can reach out to me at any time. I might email johnbieber56@gmail.com. And as Natalia said, I earned my bachelor's and master's degree at U of I in Champaign. I was working largely with sportfish behavior and physiology, working with like bluegill, largemouth bass, muskie, all that kind of stuff. And then following my master's, I was able to get started as a research associate at Loyola University in Chicago. Right now, I work in Dr. Ruben Keller's lab, looking more specifically at invasive species behavior and physiology, working with stuff mostly invertebrates, looking at stuff like scud, but also looking at rusty and red swamp crayfish, kind of their factors that might influence distribution, both in the Chicago River and potentially the Great Lakes. And then I also work on the Illinois Invasive Species Council at Aquatic Life Committee, where my main role is kind of describing potential rapid assessment tools and risk assessment tools that we might be able to use as the state in Illinois, considering kind of regional areas and different states' plans. So this will be kind of a eminent kind of similarity to what some other people may have seen already who are on the council already. And importantly, too, I will also just want to point out I will be moving to Australia to pursue a PhD in freshwater ecology at the end of the month over at the University of Technology, Sydney. That's why I just linked my Gmail for any questions like that, just not knowing how long my current college email will be lasting. Um, so yeah, just wanted to point that out. A little bit of background for what I'm doing. So to lead into this, the thing I kind of want to open up with, which is a concept I'm sure we all agree with and understand, is that species ranges are going to be changing, right? This is just a map of red swamp crayfish, specifically one from a student in my prior lab, looking at how those crayfish distributions might change into the future. So on the left side of the map, we got our 2020 kind of current or not current, 6 years old at this point, level of population distribution, right? The darker areas, we can see there's going to be more crayfish in there, lighter areas, less white, not really present detections. And then as we move over to the right with the intermediate and unmitigated, intermediate is basically we do just enough to be able to halt and or kind of curb our current climate change outlook. And unmitigated is we do absolutely nothing to change it. We let it just keep going unchecked, both into 2050 and 2070, 2050 on top, 2070 on the bottom. So looking from left to right, we can certainly see that those ranges are getting a little bit more dense. They're shifting. There's different areas that were not invaded at one point that currently are invaded, both in an intermediate and unmitigated sense. And as time kind of keeps marching forward, we see that those areas further change, especially looking at that red swamp on the left side and intermediate, right? We can see that almost that entire Great Lakes, even Ohio River Basin, is almost entirely covered by red swamp. Obviously, this is a pretty easy example. Red swamp crayfish are super prolific invaders. We would expect them to travel a lot. But nonetheless, it really does point out kind of the importance to start considering how we can mitigate and understand new invaders in our system, even if they're invaders that were not previously established before. So being able to have a good tool set to be able to understand if these new invaders could be at risk for your area, or could we see something to think about for the future as well? Having a framework to be able to understand that, it's crucial to be able to effectively manage it and effectively start thinking about pathways to consider and different techniques that we might want to use to be able to protect our waterways. So with that as kind of a super brief background, today I really hope to dive in to describe how rapid assessment tools are able to help us understand crayfish species of concern. So with this, I'm going to provide a brief introduction to rapid assessment tools, kind of in the framework of the Great Lakes region, but also as kind of aquatic invaders as a whole for what different committees and different groups have been doing. And I also hope to just introduce and describe what Illinois, but also what other states have done and or doing for assessment of invasive species. And again, focusing more on surrounding Great Lakes regions, but just to be able to give a sense of what other groups are kind of considering and different steps that we might be able to take in the future. And then I also hope to describe how rapid assessment tools have been used in the past and different rapid assessment tools as well, kind of their characteristics, what other agencies have been using. And then also, lastly, talk about how STAIR, the rapid assessment tool I'm going to dive in more specifically, along with other similar RATs, can be beneficial beyond just assessing a framework, diving a little bit more into community kind of assessment and community introduction to science. So risk assessments are an absolutely critical thing for us to use as managers, as researchers. Quite simply, once an invasive species is established and it's in a waterway, it's more or less infeasible or impossible to eradicate, right? Especially for us, we have a limited amount of resources. We don't have billions of dollars and hundreds or thousands of hours of personnel to use. And ultimately, it kind of falls under this crux of, okay, we know we're going to be getting invaders. We know there are invaders that are at risk for our waterways. And we might not really know what to do. Uncertainty exists, but regardless, we have to make a decision on what we want to do with kind of the risk, the thing that we have posed, right? Doing something is better than doing nothing. So risk assessment is a critical tool and a critical step for managers and researchers to know if a species can be considered as invasive, native, risk, high risk, low risk, kind of get a sense for what we can expect the potential impacts, either that's economically, ecologically, that this invader could have. Then following that, we're able to start better have a grasp on how those decisions on resource allocations can be considered, how they can actually be used over time. And importantly, risk assessment can also change system to system. So we kind of describe that on a more macro scale in that first point, thinking of just like countries or bigger states. But also we could think about just very small areas for how that risk assessment can be different. So we can't really have a blanket kind of option, right? Just thinking about rusty and red swamp crayfish, two of North America's largest invaders, and how they are native to the Ohio River watershed and southern Mississippi River Basin, respectively. But they're invasive in the Great Lakes region, right? So just getting a few hundred miles away is an entirely different kind of subset for what we would expect for how we would consider these individuals. And especially when we think about now with how interconnected our waterways are and can be, just with boat traffic, we can really start zooming in onto that microscopic scale to really start thinking about how to use risk assessments. So they really represent a very crucial, very important kind of tool, again, for us to think about as we are managing invaders both now and also in the future. So beyond that, we also see that people do want to have risk assessment, but there can also be inconsistent, right? Kind of a broad sweeping claim I'm making is that species are kind of evaluated on an as needed basis at meetings. That's where they're discussed. That's also where risk typically has been evaluated by those experts. So if no one brings it up on a meeting, probably nothing's going to happen with it until that following meeting. But a lot of work has shown that this can be time consuming, potentially erroneous, and in addition to that, it also just changes on meeting to meeting depending on which experts are there, right? Everyone here is busy, they have their own schedules. If you have an invader that you're super, super excited to go to, but or to super excited to bring up to your group, but you're just busy or life gets in the way and you won't be there, then your group won't know about it until the next time they're able to share that information. So it really changes both on just the typical kind of thought process for what people want and what researchers might want to introduce, but also it changes on who's there. It could just be focusing on just who is the person who's most vocal and able to bring up these points and kind of defend their uncertainties. But ultimately, to control those invasive species, there has to be unity between councils, managers, legislators, the whole shebang. There's a lot of moving pieces to actually make this work. And I'm sure, as we all understand, working across all three of those sectors and more is a relatively unfeasible task at certain levels, but certainly is a very difficult thing to do. So being able to have a framework to be able to really develop this stuff quickly and strongly will be very beneficial in the long run. And then even without that framework, right, change is just going to be difficult. So we need to be able to have a way to make our recommendations, and we need to be able to have a way to make our recommendations accurately and quickly. So with this, I want to dive into some of the current risk assessment strategies. And before I get into this, there's a very kind of general, kind of sweeping options of how these different states and agencies kind of designate and understand risk assessments for new invaders. This is pulling from meeting notes and different risk assessment plans that I've looked up for the future, or excuse me, from the past. But as far as I was able to find online, this is kind of the broad general areas that I see. So Minnesota broadly has an expert panel utilizing more heavily with a lot of literature, published studies, gray literature as well. One of the quotes I pulled is that they basically use science-based risk assessments, or they identify that science-based risk assessments are critical for preventing spread of those species. And Minnesota also, cool, I identified this species, or I found this species, or I heard of someone who found this species. Let's figure out how to be able to work around that. For Iowa, they use an education approach to reduce risk of aquatic invasive species. So being able to identify which species are important, educate the public, educate managers, educate different officers to be able to protect water bodies in Iowa. Iowa, importantly, does have a list that's able to compile species, whether they're present or absent in each water body done in Iowa. And then they also attempted to be able to expand that to look at ecological niches, ecological modeling, but ultimately that did have inconsistent results. And as a result, they really didn't use the models in those judgments. Furthermore, there is planned legislation to be able to create rank systems for water bodies, but that was something that was kind of just pointed out. I was not able to find further literature within that. So we can see with Iowa, they're trying to point towards a more quantitative kind of assessment to be able to identify these species and identify and rank that risk. Now, for Illinois, kind of our area of the Great Lakes, Illinois is also largely education-based, with looking for improved surveillance for early detection, resources for rapid responses to new invasions. Again, educating kind of those managers, the public, and also officers. Illinois also does have a current whitelist and blacklist for invasive species, so ones that we've already identified through that council. Um, but beyond that, our risk assessment is kind of expert panel, that education, whoever brings something to the table is where we start thinking about it. Similar with us is Wisconsin, where it's an expert panel approach, working within a specific kind of framework, NR40 is what they call it. But even within this, there is disagreement that does occur. Looking at expert panels that are looking at stuff like what is invasive versus what is not invasive, kind of looking at that core of the definition, where time could be spent on different things. Indiana also used that expert panel, right, recommending project priorities, using that time for application for educational grant funds, moving quarterly meetings ahead and public meetings every 2 years. So there's a strong unity between those experts and the public, being able to potentially integrate citizen scientists, different people who might be concerned, while also having those consistent times where experts can get together. And they also do acknowledge that a screening process would be very beneficial to determine which of the species are high risk or high risk of establishing themselves as invaders within their waterways. So again, pointing very heavily towards that kind of quantitative level to be able to assess new species and be able to rank them, be able to understand them more and on a more objective sense to actually apply management kind of orientation, different management interventions as well. And the last two that I like to be able to discuss today is looking at Michigan. So Michigan has the Michigan Invasive Species Program, where they identify, again, a need for regulatory decisions to have a formal risk assessment. And there's multiple frameworks I'll be talking about. But again, it's to be able to create a qualitative report that has quantitative figures, to be able to add recommendations for new laws, new procedures, and as far as the last report that I was identifying, I was not able to see whether there was progress towards actually establishing a formal risk assessment that the state will be using. And then this is kind of on the inverse as well. Still in that Great Lakes region is specific to Canada and British Columbia, where they use an alert screening network. Um, and then that is the figure that's on the right, where they are able to use up-to-date peer-reviewed models within literature searches, and they are able to utilize risk assessment framework, basically just saying flowchart, as you can see on the right, to be able to look at a new invader or all invasives as well, to be able to see how at risk their region might be. And even within that, right, there's a good framework, there's a good system, which is implemented in a very similar way in some of the other agencies I'll be discussing coming up. But ultimately, it does kind of lead us towards a quantitative assessment. That's similar way to be able to compare invaders and potential invasives, especially when we're thinking about crayfish, but also aquatic invaders as a whole. So ultimately, all of these groups very much understand the issue, right? The concept of needing a framework, a way to be able to identify and rank and understand an importance new invaders or invasive crayfish. But they lack the capacity to necessarily describe why a species is high risk. Less so than it's going correct. Literature is correct. I would believe that they would be an invader, right? We know red swamp is a high risk. But I also argued there's a certain power to be able to say, this is more high risk than another, and here's the exact process that ranked that decision for me. Some of the downfalls we see across a lot of these is that there's just a panel where people who are there are the ones that people who are there, the people who talk, the people who are more vocal kind of win. Obviously, it's kind of tongue in cheek, but if you're speaking up and you're able to defend your answer stronger than someone else, then the one that you bring up or the opinion that you might have might be the one that the panel defaults to. So the panel rather should be focusing on control measures and classification decisions, less so than necessarily going back and forth in the sense of who or what species are most important. And then also with that, we also see across all of those different agencies that risk assessment is practiced differently among different groups. And while that's okay, we also need to remember that whole concept that invaders don't follow political boundaries, right? They follow ecological boundaries at best. So with that, being able to have different groups with different mechanisms and different ways they might classify those species adds a little bit of inherent risk as well, rather than having one kind of rigorous, one strong system, or even just one strong framework that is similar across all of those systems can provide stronger unique and help us be able to potentially write grants, be able to create management interventions that could be a little bit more synonymous and a little bit more powerful, especially again, thinking about the limited resources that we have as agencies. And with this, providing quantitative proof to be able to back qualitative arguments is critical. And many states, as we saw, are already calling for kind of building a framework or just wanting that quantitative proof as well, be able to put a number to the potential invaders that we describe. So ultimately, it's important just to be able to describe why these species are high risk or why they're low risk with something like a rapid assessment tool or risk assessment tool. So think of rapid assessment tools, it's ultimately a kind of a risk assessment. It helps be able to quickly gather information to accurately classify a potential alien species risk to native flora, fauna, the environment, right? Is there a high risk invader, a low risk invader? Do we need to be worried about their establishment, or do we not need to be? Simply, rapid assessment tools, RATs, do need baseline data on priority species, some information on their pathways of introduction, right? Are they boat, barge? Are they going to be introduced through aquaria trade most likely? or a combination of all of that. And we also need to roughly identify susceptible or sensitive sites. We can do that through climate match or just through looking at connected waterways to be able to get a good sense for how these invaders might actually end up in a potential waterway as well. And then with a effectively implemented RAT, the main sources of uncertainty should be related to lack of data or differences in interpretation of an uneven evidence base, right? So maybe the definition of a term is a little bit different, or perhaps there's papers with slightly conflicting information. However, this uncertainty should be related to data, not differences in opinion, like some of the other strategies that we've seen before, right? Thinking about that discussion-based strategy among experts, where if it's just like, well, I think this might be more important than this, there's a good chance that that kind of holds up that discussion, that holds up that framework. Rather, that uncertainty should go, here's what we do know, here's what we don't know. Here is a different way that we might be able to utilize these tools or utilize researchers to be able to fill these gaps in knowledge, to be able to implement an effective strategy. Again, uncertainty exists, yet decisions still have to be made. So when we think about rapid assessment tools, there has been a number that have been created before and are still in use even today. So this is a short list of just four of the big ones that I've kind of identified over time. Again, I'm sure there's many more that I'm not familiar with, but the four big ones that I see being used in a lot of reports and a lot of agencies is first the USGS Horizon Scan method, kind of a methodology to be able to look at a new species and be able to identify how that may or may not impact a waterway you're considering. I also identified the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Rapid Assessment Program, GLANCE's Great Lakes Aquatic Non-Indigenous Species Information System, and lastly, STAIR, Science-Based Tools for Assessing Evasion Risk. So the USGS Horizon Scan method is a systematic approach to be able to look at the risk of introduction of potential invaders. Importantly, it has a very strong database with tons of good information to be able to complement potential reports and be able to help understand kind of that framework. But there is one step that I kind of identified as not ideal, is the first step of phase one is to be able to assemble a group of regional experts. And that's a problem because it's time consuming and can change over time, right? Regional experts are going to move around, people could retire, new people could come in, which is phenomenal. We want that kind of rotating base. But just be able to assemble us together can take a lot of effort and a lot of time. And ultimately, it or it culminates into a very specific report to be able to kind of guide those decisions. And eventually, that's also published as well, hopefully, to be able to describe why those were kind of made. The second U.S. Fish and Wildlife Rapid Assessment Program is basically a thorough literature search by trained individuals, summarizing info across 10 kind of broader categories, looking at stuff like climate, fecundity, just different kind of mechanisms like that. And then ultimately, it leads to a strong written document with a complementary information. But there is a good amount of that that seems to be published with gray literature. There is a good amount of publication as well, which doesn't necessarily make it less effective, but that gray literature could change over time as well. And then it ultimately leads into a thing called an ERSS, Ecological Risk Screening Summary, with categories of high risk, low risk, or uncertain risk, which is then published and shared for the public. So one of the issues that I see within this is within that 10 categories, there's also discrepancies. And it's as easy as something looking at climate, where some people describe temperate as just temperate, no information, no opinion. And then some describe it closer to temperate, right? A mesothermal climate with those temperature kind of thresholds that mean warmest month greater than 10 degrees. So while temperate could kind of be an easy scale for us to think about broadly, there still could be kind of small idiosyncratic changes that are very important in evaluating that species across a broader region or within more specific areas as well. And then lastly is GLANCES, Great Lakes Aquatic Non-Indigenous Species Information System, which is expert data for kind of the Great Lakes region. It has an impressive level of detail when species are present within the database, of which they have a mass amount of species as well. And it's also self-contained with all of the info. You're able to identify that species, look them up. You're able to get a good sense for kind of all the information going into that database. And ultimately, it culminates into a scientist expert-backed decision. But one of the big issues I identified with it is that it's specific to the United States. with no Canadian data in it. So when I bring it back to aquatic invaders don't respect political boundaries, then this data is only restricted to a political boundary. Not so like that is not powerful, but it is something to keep in mind as we think about invaders moving and invaders kind of changing space. And then lastly is the STAIR tool. So that's the science-based tools for assessing invasion risk. This was developed in Notre Dame over 13 years, published in peer-reviewed journals for a number of the species. On the right, it's kind of just a brief overview of kind of how it works for fish, crayfish, mollusks, and plants. And it already has a very large database of these individuals. And while it's focused on the Great Lakes region, it is something we can keep in mind for broader regions as well. It has been shown to work with current invaders, again, making it as easy as the red swamp and rusty crayfish, but also ones which we'll dive into coming up. And then depending on different taxa, right, different workflow, and ultimately it culminates in a report with specific described steps. So we can see how we got to that specific finding. We can see each level of it, and ultimately it culminates into like a 1 to 2 page report, depending on how you write it. It's something that can be done relatively rapidly and relatively easily. So just to bring it back a little bit, so far we have described introduction to rats, a little bit about what Illinois and other states are doing for invasive species. And now we're going to focus a little bit more on the STAIR tool and also how STAIR or other RATs can be beneficial beyond just kind of that assessment framework as well, diving into a little bit of kind of philosophical next step type thing. So to lean more into STAIR, STAIR is a powerful rapid assessment tool that's accessible and transparent. I kind of say there's no apples to oranges comparisons. The number and decisions originate from repeatable frameworks that are feasible to be completed, right? It's not just who's drafting the report, it's here are objective questions we need to answer with data going into it. The steps and questions are steps and questions to understand. They're pre-identified and kind of pre-vetted to show which species could be high risk or most important. In fact, about 40% of all crayfish have already been evaluated through STAIR, and that's a database that can continue to grow as our research kind of develops on different species, different invaders, and can be implemented relatively quickly. And beyond that, there's equal terminology as far as what we're looking for. That promotes understanding, promotes results that are able to orient expert discussion, be able to move those meetings ahead, and be able to quantify that invasion risk. And more importantly, others can also be easily trained on the STAIR tool compared to other databases, reducing workload on us, but also potentially increasing that effective use. So while not a crayfish, we were able to have an undergraduate researcher within my lab successfully utilize STAIR for a potential aquatic invasive plant as well. And she was able to accomplish that within approximately a month, going through a thorough literature review and be able to generate a report that can then be compared potentially among other people, or just be able to vet alone, depending on kind of what your organization is looking at. Again, kind of showing that STAIR is a powerful rapid assessment tool that also does work rapidly. So to bring this into a little bit more of an example for crayfish, so crayfish is an example of STAIR. This is kind of just taking a snippet of all of those parts. And again, this is a little bit broad sweeping as far as what that looks like, just a quick overview. But the first thing you'll do is determine thresholds for the random forest model. Basically, there's a whole worksheet and workflow that I'll be able to share following this as well. And you're able to look at those numbers, compare it to either the random forest or logistic regression, or both. Random forest is a little bit more accurate. And if the species is not on the table, then it's as easy as seeing if you have information for kind of clutch size and species size as well. So you can look on the right for number 3, where if it's not on the table, right? We just plug it right into that denominator in the equation for that clutch scaled or clutch max. So if we have it, it's easy to plug it in. If we don't, quick little calculation to get a good sense for that likelihood of invasion. And then we just compare it to the probabilities that have been predetermined already based off of some other previous review as well, where you can basically identify your thresholds and then you can start understanding that risk or that level of undesirable risk that you wish to not have. So again, really fast, really quick workflow. And again, if we don't have it, we can just get more research to be able to identify that as well. So to bring it to an actual level for STAIR, I'm introducing you to the Australian red claw crayfish, which I'm sure a number of you might be familiar with. I had to pull it up because Australia. But so far, it's been found in Texas, Nevada, California, Puerto Rico, and already it has been classified within STAIR. It's one of those 40% that has been already gone through that workflow. And it's been classified as invasive already, potentially invasive for the Great Lakes region. But to be able to kind of walk us through it, here's kind of a snippet from that table that you would see, looking at the species name, global invasion, status, the random force and likelihood ratio, likelihood for establishment or invasive. And we can see those numbers there as well. For the rest of this, since we have the random forest, I'm just going to be describing within those first two numbers. So we take that, and then this is that graph from the STAIR tool that's already been pre-established with those guidelines. And then to zoom it in a little bit more closely, we're going to take those numbers, I have them up on top, where the RFM established and invasive are 0.95, 0.99. Obviously, no, it's already quite high, so it's a relatively easy example. But we're able to take this, look at the graphs of established invasive. That light gray bar right in the middle is basically the likelihood of being established or excuse me, not established or not invasive versus established or invasive. That dotted line is where all species that are established or invasive could be categorized as well, so everything on the left. The black line is where no safe species can be classified as a risk, but it might actually miss some invaders. So we can see along this gradient, right, we have three options to be very conservative, be very realistic, or be less conservative as well. And that's something that can kind of rotate and yet again provide quantitative evidence in quantitative ways for us to be able to develop our decisions on a potential invader, where that crayfish, that red claw crayfish, will certainly be very far on the right side into being more in that invasive and established kind of realm. So we can consider that as a quite high risk species. And with that, we functionally just accomplish a very fast risk as a rapid assessment tool kind of procedure, right? We're able to take these organisms and within this framework of about 5 minutes or less, we're able to see and be able to create a decision on how these invaders could impact the Great Lakes. So when we think about this, we can think about each of these in a bubble. How would these work if there were to be a new species of concern that's identified that has no information about them at all? We might know a little bit about their reproduction, and for the sake of the argument, I'll say we do in the sense of clutch size. Where the USGS Horizon Scan, the first thing we need to do is be able to establish a panel of experts, reach out to them, schedule a meeting, to then be able to go through the rest of that process. Again, time intensive. For the rapid assessment program, we have to check if it's been assessed. If not, same thing, we'll need a panel of experts to then draft that report. For Glanzis, if it's not on the website, then there's just not a method for us to be able to necessarily understand it, right? We can apply different similar individuals or similar ontogeny or similar invasion to be able to presume it. But if it's not in that website, then we don't really know what to do. But for the STAIR, we're able to go through that analysis framework, get a sense of that invasion risk. And then if we don't have that information, we also already have a targeted research question, right? Looking at clutch size, looking at length of individual, looking at growth patterns, kind of different morphometric information as well, just to be able to complement that, be able to create an assessment. And right there, we already have a plan for how to move forward with a new invader. And again, this is kind of thinking of the species that we've never really seen before. And the reason why we know that this is important is because time is one of the most important factors for a new species of concern, right? The sooner we can catch it, the better off we are to be able to prevent kind of the impact of those invasions and the scale of the invasions, right? The longer we wait, the more time that spreads, the more likely they are to increase in abundance and be able to become widespread and abundant throughout, kind of leading to all of those potential risks that a new invasive crayfish could kind of have within an ecosystem. So be able to catch them early and be able to make decisions early on how to be able to work with them is crucial to be able to protect the ecosystems that we identify as important and be able to protect the resources that we want to maintain over time as well. Time is the most crucial factor within an invasion kind of timeline overall. So that is why a rapid assessment is so critical, is we're able to catch that early, be able to make that decision early and allocate those resources effectively. So overall, though, all of these tools do accomplish a rapid assessment in the sense of there is a decision that they are able to be made. STAIR is, however, in my opinion, able to work very quickly. There's no one-size-fits-all tool either, importantly. All of these tools rely on literature, they rely on interpretation of research, but we should prioritize ultimately tools that minimize the effort and are able to maximize accurate recommendations, right? Like an adjustable wrench, we're able to kind of keep the same tool, but move it around on a case-by-case basis for what we need to use it for. And then ultimately, we should really consider regional specific rapid assessment tools that can be developed, similar to that STAIR tool for the Great Lakes region, where a good amount of work's been done to be able to identify climate, be able to put in effort to be able to identify species that are likely to establish, both here and abroad, where this can already have a framework that's ready to go. We're going to just plug and chug in case that species moves, which, as we see with the red swamp crayfish, we're going to see a lot of movement over time and a lot of future movement likely in the future as well. But ultimately, we should prioritize as simple as possible data-driven quantitative plans to guide the decisions that we have. And the reason why this is so critical is that providing quantitative proof of change and development is important to be able to create that decision-making and management, right? Having data is kind of a strong scope for adaptive management frameworks that many management bodies are already using. Right? If we don't have data, we don't know if our implementation was actually effective, did nothing, was less effective than what we were aiming for, and then we don't know if we're accomplishing the management goals that we sought out to actually go for. And furthermore, literature has also shown strong support for usage of data-oriented assessments. So there's been work that shows that data frameworks like STAIR are comparable to expert opinions, but they actually also have lower variance. So being able to use these frameworks is close enough to having an expert panel to be able to create those management interventions and management recommendations. Furthermore, work has also shown that with minimal training, people outside of experts are able to effectively use these frameworks as well. Thinking about citizen science and different kind of things as well, we're able to put in a little bit of time to be able to integrate further public support, further use of resources, which might free up a little bit more time for us. Ultimately, right, that's effective for groups that have busy schedules, or just if you have a busy schedule too, then you're able to effectively kind of implement these new resources to be able to, right, create those recommendations where you don't necessarily have to sit down, go to a dozen meetings potentially, and then figure out how to implement this. So providing that simple, established critical framework is important. And again, I'm highlighting the STAIR tool in the sense that even across all of these taxa, right, for crayfish, it's that 4-step sheet, mollusks, is a 6-step sheet. We have an established critical framework that can just be gone through, and that's the report. Most of these risk assessments begin with expert panels, circulate around regular meetings, which may happen often, may not happen often, depending on different timelines. And providing a framework like STAIR will allow for progress to be made before, during, and after meetings. So it doesn't have to wait for a meeting for an opinion on this animal or potential species invader to be made. Rather, we're able to start working constructively throughout that timeline as well. And importantly, a quantitative framework will be able to provide learning opportunities for students and citizen scientists alike, boosting trust among all agencies involved, thinking that scientists who are engaged in, or citizens that are engaged in citizen scientists generally are a little bit more trustworthy of agencies, trustworthy of scientists. And for students, it provides a great mode to be able to start getting more involved and more understanding, or gain a more thorough understanding of management frameworks, how science works, and a way to be able to get them involved more broadly in science. So ultimately, to wrap it all up, we have to identify how we are living in a changing world, right? Introduction of aquatic invaders is only going to be increasing over time. Waterways are more connected than they ever have been before. Thinking of boat traffic, cars, travel, we're able to go worldwide if we want to, potentially bringing invaders around the world. The world's also just more globalized. So that aquarium trade is going to be increasing. We're going to be getting unfamiliar species in unfamiliar places. Again, just thinking about Australian red claw crayfish. being found within kind of that southern US, even Puerto Rico, right? The only way they can get from Australia to Texas is probably through an airplane, highlighting that globalized kind of change where we're going to be encountering new species potentially more often than we have before in years past. So we better be better equipped to understand this and be able to understand them. And even within that, just climate change intensifying. It's going to change the way that waterways work, right? It could be as easy as rivers are going to increase. So then their streams, rivers, lakes are going to be more interconnected just physically from that start. But also thinking about the ranges that are appropriate for different species as well is crucial as we start to think about the way that we want to manage crayfish and other invaders in the future. When we think about that too, just to reel it into crayfish, is invasive crayfish are among the most introduced freshwater invaders that we have, right? Crayfish can and they will move when they can, right? If they have a better environment to go to, they're going to check it out and they're going to have a likelihood of establishment. And ultimately, as managers and researchers, we should be equipped to take action for those areas that we have. Thinking of the weirdest crayfish or weirdest organism that get in there, we should have a framework to be able to identify and be able to rank these species. And ultimately, like I said, I introduced multiple different frameworks, but having that quantitative assessment that's objective and able to be evaluated and critiqued independent of panels, I think is a very crucial step ahead as we think about the changing world that we are in. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions and anything at all. I appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John, for that great presentation and a really great introduction to risk assessment tools and STAIR too. So thank you for introducing that to us.
Thank you.
So as our participants are thinking about some questions, taking some time to write in the chat, I had a couple of questions for you if you could help answer them.
Yep.
So from my understanding, the geographic scope of STAIR is just the Great Lakes region, which includes the Great Lakes states and the provinces as well, or what's okay. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And then how long does it take, would you say, to complete a STAIR assessment, specifically for crayfish?
Yep. So specifically for crayfish, thinking that you have access to Google Scholar, or you just have a good understanding of the species that you're concerned about, um, I would argue it could take anywhere from 5 minutes to potentially like an hour or two, depending on how much you need to find or if there's conflicting information. For me with the red collar crayfish, I was fortunate. It was one of those 40% that were already kind of mapped out and charted within the STAIR guidelines and STAIR resources. So it's as easy as take those numbers, put them on the graph, see where they are, and then right there I can classify it as a likely invader or a not likely invader. But if there's a species that's yet to be researched, or we don't know clutch size, or we know nothing about it, then obviously that could take a little bit longer, think in the sense of we just need to find that out. So then that goes into those research timelines, potential grant cycles. A little bit more information needs to be figured out about them. But similar with that, that's kind of a pitfall of any invasive thing that we find, right? If we know nothing about it, it's going to take a little bit of time to understand how they work and if they're even likely to be an invader.
Okay. And then with clutch size, you talked about that a little bit and how that's one of the variables that you use to assess risk in different crayfish species. Are there other available variables that are used to assess risk other
So
than the clutch size?
pull it back. Let's see where I have the graph. So we can see kind of the two main things that go into it for us thinking about stakeholders, or not stakeholders, as researchers, is that clutch max size and that clutch scaled. So number of eggs per clutch, along with just the total number of eggs that are in there.
Okay,
It's
your screen
sponsored.
is paused, by the way. I'm not sure
Oh,
if you were showing your presentation or not.
oh, I had the wrong button. 1 second.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you for letting me know. Are you able to see that?
Yeah.
It's the example start. Perfect. So we got that clutch size versus that number of eggs, right? That's important thinking about different potential propagule pressures, number of individuals in that population that could spread. We also want to look at carapace length. As far as the actual metrics that kind of inform this tool, there's been a lot of really fancy math that is well beyond my own scope. Because I understand it, it's worked a lot with kind of metadata data to be able to look at which invaders have established in different regions, look at variables such as climate, different kind of stuff like that to be able to incorporate into those models for that random forest and likelihood ratio. So with this, it is kind of a number of factors that have been inputted in this. I'm currently not familiar with exactly which ones, but that's something I can go back to the literature, double check on that, and report back on that for sure.
Okay, thank you. So Ann Allert in the chat asked if one of the websites that she linked to is where you can find STAIR. It's on the Take Aim website. I believe that's the most, I'm not sure if it's the most
Yeah.
updated version of STAIR. Hopefully you can
Ye-
confirm that, John.
Yes, so that is STAIR, correct. So you'll be able to see all of the invasive species plans on there. And then once you click on it, there's like the mollusks, crayfish, fish, and plants. There's PDFs with some species information, as well as kind of those workflows in there as well. So you'll be able to kind of get a good sense for all of those invaders and how it might be able to apply to your system.
Okay, and then I also linked in the chat the species assessments for crayfish. I found the PDF on the Taking website as well. Um, so that's the 40% that you guys assessed, correct?
Yes, you got it.
Perfect. So people can look at that and um, kind of see where that they've ranked. Um, okay, cool. Okay, so another question. Besides red claw crayfish, you talk a little bit about them in the presentation.
Mhm.
Are there crayfish species on your radar right now that you think warrant closer attention or assessment in the Great Lakes region?
At present, there's none that are on my personal radar. I am a little bit more on the outside. I know on the council and stuff, but on the outside of identifying those new invaders, rather I've been focusing more on the invasions that have been in there, to be able to better guide those. But with that said, I'm not familiar with any current ones that we have not already identified as species of concern. Um, However, yeah, I'm not positive yet. That's a good question though.
Yeah, I'm wondering if anybody in the chat or you guys can even just unmute yourselves and talk about it. Have your states specifically reported a specific crayfish that's kind of um, warranted some more attention in your area? I know that, for example, signal crayfish, the appearance of that in Minnesota has been um, really popular. So I'm wondering what people have been talking about in regards to that in Minnesota. But if not, this could be a conversation after the webinar as well. um, okay, great. Also seeing no questions in the Q&A, none in the chat. I had a question that I wasn't sure I was going to get to, um, and it is kind of a hot topic and kind of a point of contention, but AI. Because, like you said, time is one of the most important factors for a new species of concern. Um, are there any strides in using AI and machine learning systems to help kind of expand the scale and the speed of risk analyses?
So I think one of the traditional AI things that I always consider is iNaturalist and like Google Images and right, you can just take a picture of it and it'll just tell you what's going on. Um, I think that's a very valuable resource in the sense of like you're likely to have a false detection, but I argue a verified false detection is much better than having no detection, as far as potential species. However, it can also lead to pitfalls, right? Thinking about using that data to inform something like if you're trying to create a model like STAIR within your system. Being able to use that data will be crucial, but also being able to vet that data is super important. So as far as using AI for something like a risk assessment tool or being able to do that, I've yet to find something that would be necessarily super effective as far as that framework, plug in this information, get us the information. It could be useful to curate a start for that information. But as you can see with STAIR, it's a relatively quick, easy few-step process. But AI has been able to be used, AI has been able to be used for those initial identifications, but obviously it could lead us back three steps, right? If we are sure that this, I'll say again, Australian red claw crayfish has been spotted up in Trout Lake in Wisconsin. Then we're going to put a lot of resources right there, figure it out. We're not going to drain the lake. We're just going to hope, see what happens. So that could be a pitfall of using AI.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely has to be checked by a human for sure. Um, so we got a question in the chat from Maureen who says that marbled crayfish presence in trade is concerning, which I definitely agree.
Mhm.
Um, where does that fall in these models?
Let me see.
Yeah, feel
Pull
free
up.
to use the resource because that's hard to talk about on off the top of your head.
Let's see. So I'm going to pull up actually that risk assessment that you already had, Natalia. So let's see if I can find them on there. Okay, where's Virginalis?
I'm wondering, so Procambarus phalanx was the species that the marbled crayfish kind of originated from, I believe. I don't see Virginalis
Yeah.
on the assessment. Yeah, so maybe it's a little outdated there.
So that is something, yeah, because I can't remember when this was uploaded. I will be able to do a brief literature search. So this is one of those examples, right? Right now, we don't have it on our 40% that we already have within that STAIR kind of framework. And, working this real time, if it was really any other option, what do we do? Right? I'm about to schedule a meeting with five, six experts to be able to coordinate this. And instead, right now, I know I need to figure out carapace length, clutch size. I can plug it into those models that the stair has. And then I'm able to create an evaluative framework to bring to that meeting and or a way to be able to understand how that works within this kind of framework. So that is something I can do a little bit of literature search on as well. And I'd be more than happy to probably email you, Natalia, with a quick little report of what I was able to figure out. Um, and then that's something you could probably send out to the group, assuming you have everyone's emails. I'd be more than
Yeah,
happy to share that information as well to kind of show another implementation of the STAIR tool as a rapid assessment tool.
yeah, we'll be able to contact you, Maureen, individually too. Thanks for doing that. Yeah, I know marbled crayfish is very, very new, so it makes complete sense that it's still not yet on this assessment, which I believe was posted in 2016, which is a very long time ago.
Yeah.
Um, and then Patrick, you mentioned in the chat you've had signal crayfish on your radar after finding them in Minnesota, along with marbled, given prevalence in trade and the population found in Ontario, and always have red swamp crayfish on the radar. And then of course also the typical trade species like Carex, Everglades, etc. Yeah, so lots of different invaders that we definitely got to be vigilant for.
No, like I said that's the one thing I like is yeah, I'm pushing STAIR, but it's a quantitative assessment framework. Is right now I have multiple species to look into, and I have multiple species I'm able to add a little bit more information to, again, kind of informing that adaptive management framework as well.
Okay. Seeing no other questions or comments in the chat or in the Q&A box, I guess we'll wrap it all up. Thank you again, John, for coming out and talking about risk assessment. STAIR has been really, really insightful. And thanks everyone for your comments and for just joining. And safe travels to Australia. um,
Thank you.
Good luck with everything. Hopefully this isn't our last time speaking with you.
Definitely not. I
Okay.
appreciate your time. I appreciate the questions as well. And like I said, I'll get to work on looking a little bit more into marbled crayfish as well. And
Yep.
I'll forward that on for anyone
Yeah.
who's interested.
Yeah, please do. Thank you. All right. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.